You are standing at the edge of a reed marsh, somewhere in the lowland plain between two great rivers. The air is warm and thick with the smell of silt and decomposing vegetation. Somewhere behind you, a cluster of mud brick structures rises from the flat earth, smoke curling from cooking fires. The sound of children mixing with the low of livestock penned close to the walls. A woman inside one of those structures has been laboring since before dawn. She's surrounded by two older women, on one of whom has done this many times before. There are no instruments. There is no sterile cloth. There is only knowledge passed down through generations, a fire kept burning to warm the space, and the slow, terrifying machinery of new life forcing itself into the world. In the same settlement, near the edge of the built area where the ground is slightly elevated above the floodplain, a man has just died. He was not old by our measure, perhaps 35 years, but he was old by theirs. His family is already gathering, already beginning the rituals that will prepare him for whatever comes next. In this world, birth and death are not separated by long stretches of ordinary life. They are neighbors. They happen within earshot of each other, and the people who navigate them carry centuries of inherited belief about what those two thresholds mean. We are in approximately 4000 BC, at the end of the late Ubaid period, and the earliest stirrings of what we now call the Uruk world. This is southern Mesopotamia, the land that will eventually become Sumer, and it is already ancient. Settlements like Eridu, which some traditions consider the first city ever built, have been inhabited for 1,000 years by this point. The people here are not primitive wanderers. They are farmers, craftspeople, traders, and administrators in training. They are building the foundations of urban life one season at a time. And yet, for all the organizational capacity they are beginning to develop, the most fundamental experiences of existence, coming into life and leaving it, remain raw, intimate, and freighted with spiritual meaning that we can only partially reconstruct. This is where the ancient texts become important, not as literal historical records, but as windows into how people understood the forces shaping their lives. The traditions that would eventually crystallize into the Book of Enoch, into the genealogies of Genesis, into the Sumerian king list, all of them gesture toward an era before the Great Flood, when the world was different. When beings of extraordinary size and power walked among ordinary humans. When the boundary between the divine and the mortal was permeable in ways it no longer seemed to be by the time those texts were written down. According to the tradition carried in early Enochic literature, the Watchers, those divine beings who descended and took human partners, produced offspring of unusual stature and appetite, children who did not fit comfortably into human categories of birth and belonging. Whether one reads these accounts as theology, mythology, or cultural memory of a time when early populations encountered extraordinary individuals, what they communicate clearly is this: the people of the pre-Diluvian world understood birth as a moment of cosmic consequence. A child did not simply arrive. A child was the intersection of worlds, the mortal and the divine, the known and the unknowable. This belief shaped everything that surrounded the act of giving birth in a 4000 BC settlement. Excavations at sites like Tel El Ubaid and the lower levels of Eridu have revealed evidence of ritual deposits near domestic spaces, small figurines, animal bones, objects that appear to have served apotropaic functions, meaning they were meant to ward off malevolent forces. We know from slightly later Sumerian and Akkadian texts that childbirth was considered a spiritually dangerous time, a moment when the boundary between life and non-life was thin enough that hostile powers might slip through. The goddess Ninmah shaped human beings from clay, according to one tradition. Another tradition gave that creative role to Enki. Still, others involved a divine midwife whose protection was essential. The women of 4000 BC did not yet have these fully articulated mythologies in the forms we know. But the impulse behind them, the need to invoke protective forces at the moment of maximum vulnerability, that impulse is clearly visible in the material record. The practical reality of childbirth in this period was severe. Paleopathological studies of skeletal remains from Ubaid period sites show high rates of maternal mortality and infant death. It is estimated that anywhere from 20 to 30% of births in this era resulted in the death of the infant before the first year was completed. Maternal mortality was similarly devastating. A woman who survived 5 pregnancies was fortunate. A woman who survived 10 was exceptional. The bodies recovered from burial sites tell this story quietly. Young adult females with signs of repeated pregnancy-related trauma. Infants buried with unusual care, often in vessels or specially prepared containers, as if their smallness required a different kind of container for their journey. And the journey is where ancient belief becomes especially vivid. The Ubaid people were careful buriers. Unlike some earlier prehistoric populations who left the dead in ways that suggest less elaborate ritual, the Ubaid communities typically interred their dead in formal cemeteries, often close to the settlement but clearly demarcated from the living space. Bodies were laid in specific orientations, sometimes on their sides in flexed positions reminiscent of the fetal position, which scholars have interpreted as a symbolic return to pre-birth states, a curling back toward origin. Grave goods were included, pottery vessels that likely contained food or water, small personal objects, occasionally figurines. What this tells us is that the people of 4000 BC believed death was not the end of a person's journey. It was a transition requiring preparation, provision, and ritual care. Consider what a burial would have looked like in this settlement. The man who died this morning was someone whose absence will be practically felt. A laborer, a farmer, a member of the communal irrigation work that keeps the fields from drying out in the brutal summer heat. His body must be prepared before the heat accelerates decomposition. And in the southern Mesopotamian lowlands in summer, that window is very short.
We offer this bounty to
the women of the household would wash the body. This is attested in later Sumerian lament literature and almost certainly reflects practices far older. They would arrange the limbs. They might apply ochre, a red mineral pigment found in burial contexts at multiple Ubaid sites, though its exact significance remains debated. Was it symbolic of blood, of life, of fire? Was it protective coloring for the journey ahead? We do not know with certainty, but we know it mattered enough to be carried to distant sites and deliberately placed with the dead. The grave would be dug by men of the community, probably at the recognized burial ground at the edge of the settlement. The soil here in the alluvial plain is soft, easy to move, but it also means the water table is close. In flood years, graves could be inundated, which is part of why elevated ground was prized. The body would be lowered in, positioned with care, maybe the grave goods arranged around it. Then the earth would close over it, and what happened next was in the hands of forces the living could only hope to have properly addressed through their rituals. Now imagine the scene happening simultaneously on the other side of the settlement. The woman who has been laboring since dawn has delivered. The child is breathing. In a world where so many did not survive this moment, the sound of an infant's first cry was not merely joyful. It was a reprieve, a confirmation that the protective rituals had worked, that whatever forces guarded or threatened the threshold of birth had allowed this passage. The older woman who served as midwife would sever the umbilical cord, likely with a reed or a sharpened stone tool. The child would be cleaned, wrapped in cloth or animal skin. The placenta, in many ancient traditions, was treated as a spiritual entity in its own right, buried or disposed of in specific ways to prevent it from being accessed by harmful forces. We see evidence of this kind of thinking in later Mesopotamian texts, where the placenta was sometimes called the child's twin. The naming of the child was another threshold moment. In many ancient traditions, a child without a name existed in a kind of spiritual limbo, not yet fully anchored to the world of the living. Names carried protective and identity-forming power. They might invoke a deity, describe a hoped-for quality, or mark the circumstances of birth. A child born during a flood might be named for water. A child born in a difficult year might carry that difficulty as a kind of acknowledgement. The Sumerian king list, which describes rulers before the flood as having reigned for tens of thousands of years, captures something of how ancient people thought about the weight of names and lineages. How identity was not simply personal, but cosmic, connecting the individual to the long chain of those who had come before. Those impossibly long reigns in the king list are fascinating not as literal history, but as cultural expression. Ancient texts describe the pre-Diluvian rulers as beings of a different order, closer to the divine, capable of things no ordinary human could achieve. According to the tradition, this included longevity that defied normal biological limits. The Book of Enoch frames this differently, describing the offspring of the Watchers and human women as giants. Hybrids who inherited power from both worlds but belonged fully to neither. Whether these traditions encode memories of actual historical figures of unusual ability or stature, or whether they are attempts to explain why the earliest human accomplishments seemed superhuman in retrospect, is something scholars continue to debate. What they clearly express is a belief that the people of the earliest times were different, and that birth in that era produced different results, and that something was lost, perhaps in the flood, perhaps through divine decree, that reduced human potential to more ordinary dimensions. That sense of lost magnitude haunts early Mesopotamian religion in a way that is genuinely moving. The flood narrative, which appears across multiple ancient traditions and almost certainly reflects real catastrophic flooding events in the lowland plains sometime in the 5th and 4th millennia B.C., was understood as a rupture point. Before it, one kind of world. After it, something smaller, shorter-lived, less connected to the divine. The burial rites of 4000 BC may be read in this light as attempts to maintain connection across that rupture, to honor the dead in ways that preserve their relationship with whatever powers governed existence, to ensure that those who crossed the threshold of death could find their way in a world the living could no longer see. Bro, today, you can stand at the site of Eridu in southern Iraq, near the modern city of Nasiriyah, and look out over a landscape that has changed enormously since these people lived here. The marshes have been drained and restored and drained again. The rivers have shifted their courses. The mud brick structures have long since dissolved back into the earth from which they were made. But the cemetery areas excavated by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd in the 1940s and 1950s revealed those carefully positioned bodies, those grave goods, those silent testimonies to the belief that death was not an ending. And in museums in Baghdad and London and Philadelphia, the small clay figurines recovered from these sites look out at us from their cases with eyes inlaid in bitumen, watching, waiting, still performing whatever protective function they were made to perform 6,000 years ago. What endures across all of this is not any specific belief about what happens after death, but the impulse itself the absolute human refusal to let death or birth be merely biological events. In every culture we have evidence for. At every point in the archaeological record, people have surrounded these thresholds with meaning, with ritual, with art, with story. The people of 4000 BC had no less inner life than we do. They wept at the same moments. They held their breath at the same moments. They tried, as we try, to make sense of the fact that we arrive and we depart and the world continues without us. Vast and indifferent, and somehow still, stubbornly, ours. If there are ancient thresholds you want to cross in future episodes, moments in history where the human experience of birth and death looked radically different from today, let us know in the comments. We are always listening for the next world to reconstruct.